You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is April 18th, 2024 at 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I thought that I would talk a little bit about exploration tonight. We often talk about these preliminary practices being the development of secure attachment if you start out with insecure, disorganized attachment. And one of the aspects of that is the exploration piece. So you have the attachment system that turns on when you're frightened and are in need of proximity to somebody who will protect you. So imagine yourself as a child needing that because the world is a frightening place. But when you're met by the caregivers and they help you settle, then the attachment system turns off and the exploration system turns on. The third piece we often talk about is the collaborative relationship system, where you figure out how to be in relationships where, as an adult, you take care of somebody else in the way that they need to be taken care of so that they can take care of you in a way that you need to be taken care of. And that purpose of that is primarily to support your capacity to explore so that you can really go out to the edges of what you need to find out so that your life is rich and meaningful to you. Fairly simple. But there's a lot of pieces in here that can go wrong at different times, and a lot of things that need to be present in order for you to actively engage in exploration. The first aspect is to discern between secondary exploration and primary exploration. And the main difference there is that in secondary exploration, we're gathering the time, energy, and the resources which we'll need to use to support us as we engage in primary exploration. The primary exploration is really organized around meaning. What does the activity when you're engaged in it mean? What does the activity when you're engaged in it mean to you? And then, of course, we have this terrible burden of culture to figure out. And it really, those early instructions in culture are the culture of the family system you grow up in, and what's valuable to them, and what they see you as engaging in, and how well you're finding meaning in that culture lines up. So did you luck out and have caregivers that were interested in who you were and interested in how you experienced the world and understood what your gifts, your talents were, and encouraged you to develop those and to explore them? And did they provide for you the support that you needed so that you could do that, so that you had the rare opportunity, and this is quite unusual in our culture, that your primary exploration is the activity that you can engage in, and at the same time, it produces the resources that you need in order to pursue the activity. I say it's quite rare because in our culture, there's a set of values, and that if your interests line up with them, and they're highly held in our culture, then there is an amazing amount of resources that are then made available to that. But often we find that the things that matter to us, the things that are interesting to us, are not also valued in the culture that we live in. And so the resources that are allotted to them by the overall culture are quite a bit less, almost to the point where they're not really supported at all. And when that's the case, we need to then somehow generate the time, energy, and resources and allot them in such a way that we're supported in the way that we need to be. And also we have the capacity to explore. Is that all making sense so far? If you grew up in a family system where you were encouraged to really engage in the activities that had meaning to you, you're going to have a long history of discovering what's meaningful and what isn't meaningful. And you're going to have the time to develop the capacity to explore in a way that you need to, so that you can really go deeply into the things that matter to you. And if you didn't have that as a child or as an adolescent, then really the first time you're going to be able to engage in that kind of thing is in your youth. So I like to break these periods of life down mainly by the biological aging of the body. I know we're all going to live to be 120, and we're going to be really sharp and in good physical shape by the time we get there. Somebody sent me a book about the proper diet for living to be 120. And being the cynical person that I am, I typed into Google, how many people alive today are 120 or older? Guess what the number was? 0. Apparently, only 4 or 5 people in a generation live beyond their 100 and teens. So I eat a vegan diet and I exercise. I do all those things because I am sensitive to the impact of gravity on my overall body. And I'm always disappointed when I read books on diets, because I'm really already doing all of those things mostly. So let's say birth to 10 is childhood. Then the adolescent period is from 10 to say 20, and then youth is from 20 to 30. There's a period of your young adulthood, which let's say is between 30 and 40. In our culture, that's the place where you set up your sprint at the gold ring, and then that main adult period in our culture where you're in a position to gather as much as you can. It starts at about 40 and goes into your early 50s, maybe to your mid 50s. If you're extraordinarily successful, it extends beyond your mid 50s, but then the pressure of younger people coming up, plus the changes in the physicality of the body, make that sprint hard to pursue. And then if you recognize that these changes are happening in your early 50s, you begin to prepare for old age, which starts at 55. And then 55 to 75 is old age. And most people don't get beyond old age, but there is a group, maybe 20% of people who live beyond that. And that's largely genetics. I like to say it's all genetics minus lifestyle. That's how you predict how old you're going to end up. If you get the longevity genes, then you move into your 80s and 90s. We will call that old age. So in childhood, of course, you're growing. And then in adolescence, there's that change where the brain really moves from a child's brain, which is just this whole boron of axons that aren't really connected to anything, so that you can learn at this incredible rate that children can learn, slow cognitively, but fast learning. And then in that transition in adolescence where the brain is pruned down to the barest scaffolding of things that are connected and the cognitive mind goes way up. That period's 10 to 20. The human brain does not really complete its development until the mid 20s. So then you have that extraordinary period of your 20s, youth, where you're moving away from the controlling authoritative caregiver system into the pathways that you want to explore for yourself. Now, mind you, we're also confined by the culture. When I was in my teens and early 20s, you could work a minimum wage job and rent an apartment and buy a car. You cannot work a minimum wage job now and rent an apartment anywhere in the country or buy a car. So well, the realities are quite different in the way that the culture has changed. But the 20s is really about that period of exploration to find out what it is that you want to do with this one wild and precious life you have, as infer Mary Oliver, the poet. And then at the end of your 20s, you stop growing and you begin to age. Has everybody had that experience of coming into the end of the 20s or the early 30s, then all of a sudden that spring youth begins to top over the hill into the process of aging? There's a settling of that energy in the early 30s, and maybe by the middle of the 30s, you're in that energy level you're going to have. Maybe it's a reduction of a third of what that youthful energy was. And then you go along in navigating the adult range of things that you can do, jockeying for position in our culture so that you can really compete. Now, again, to really compete, you have to be in one of the groups that has advantages in our culture. If you're not in one of those groups, you don't really get to compete at the same level that people who are in those groups get to. One of the statistics that came out from the UN a couple of weeks ago was a survey of pay equity between males and females, and they evaluated how many countries in the world do women have pay parity with men, and what do you think the answer was? 0. So we have to understand that context. If you look at the United States, if you're white, you make $1, and if you're not white, you make 51 cents for the same work. It's very stark how that plays out here. So if you're a not white woman, you make 74, women make 74 cents for every dollar men make. And if you're not a white woman, you're making 74% of 51%. 51 cents. Is that making sense? So just so you understand that when we say that we're comparing apples to apples, the game isn't even. It's not fair. And it's very hard to overcome that in any realistic way. But we still have the potential for exploring things that have meaning to us. And one of the aspects of that is going to be resilience to explore. When you begin to understand how unusual it is to really find something that's meaningful in the activities that you engage in, what you begin to understand is how many avenues you have to go down to really discover the things that are meaningful to you. And in order to pursue and explore in a deep enough way to really arrive at something that's meaningful, you have to be able to tolerate so many of the avenues that you pursue not really paying off. Is that making sense? And how really do you do that? Well, you don't mind it so much because you understand that that's actually how it is. And you have a social network that you've developed around you that also understands this and supports you to really go for the things that you need. To know, that's what it is. You need to know something so that you feel lively and alive in the world. Where does that resilience come from? Well, the early part of it is really in that dyadic experience of the caregiver responding to you. So that cycle of security, the child, the infant. Have you? A friend of mine just had a baby, and I've been. I met the baby when it was 5 days old, and I've been seeing it uh, over the last few weeks, and it's a tiny, tiny thing. Can you remember somewhere in your experience what it was like for you to be such a tiny, tiny thing? And how dependent we are on the way that somebody takes care of us, and how we understand both ourselves and the nature of the world based on that care. So you just cry out. And it's such a sweet, at least for me, the experience of that, there's a sweetness to it. And then there's an interest. What is it? What is it that you really need in that moment? And you can see in the different ways that, at least I can see in the different ways that people respond, um, their capacity for sensitivity, their capacity for really understanding what it is that's being expressed, and then the mirroring back of that, the reassurance that comes from it. And then the response of the care that the infant needs in that. We all have had the experience of it. None of us remember it because of the nature of the human condition. But we could infer from the things that happen later, from the way that we're able to engage ourselves in the world, what must have happened in that early dyadic relationship with our caregivers. We make a gesture to the world, and the world responds. And that creates for us this expectation of what will happen for us. And it's very early, very pernicious in the way that it infuses the sense of reality that we create now in each moment. If you had that good enough care that 30% of the time, your needs were met well, then what you expect is that you can express your needs and that the world will respond by meeting them. And that informs your exploration in the way that you go about it. And if your needs are met reliably, you don't worry about that aspect. You can pursue it. And later, as the child grows in those secure environments and the process of discovery begins to uh, happen, I know you don't remember this, but if you've been around small children, what you'll notice is that the first thing that they do is, and I've said this a million times, they do thousands of little crunches so that they can begin to sit up. And a small child can't even sit up. They can't really even roll over. All of that is the process of movement in childhood in order to be able to do that. And once they're able to get on their belly, they creep along, little push-ups, little leg lifts until they're up and they're crawling. And that's really the beginning of exploring. That experience there is where your relationship to exploration really begins. Did you have a caregiver that was attentive to you? When you're in the blob stage, I like to say, your caregiver could put you down and you're going to be there when they come back, right? You can't get that far. Even when you're in the creeping stage, when you're trying to drag yourself across the floor so that you can discover something, maybe you could get 3 feet by the time they come back, but when you're crawling, you can really begin to cover territory. But you need that emotional resilience that comes from the caregiver supporting you as you do that. And that's one of the essential pieces of where this resilience and exploration comes from. The child used to being in very close proximity to the caregiver begins to venture out. They move 3 feet out and they turn around and they look at the caregiver to see whether they're okay, whether they're safe. You know, when children get up on twos and they run, and in that beginning period of figuring it out, they sort of run perfectly straight up. It's kind of comical. And then if they trip, they'll do a face plant, just a body face plant. And it's a sudden rush of sensation. And then they turn around to look at their caregiver. And sometimes the caregiver will respond by saying, "Oh, you're all right. Come on, get up. Let's keep going. Let's keep exploring. You're going to be fine." And that child lets that rush of sensation arise and pass, and then off they go, where the parent rushes in and entwines the child and worries about the safety of the child and begins a process of inhibiting the child's freedom to explore. That affects the resiliency. So what we're really looking for in early childhood, and the people that are advantaged in exploration had the experience of being encouraged to separate from the caregiver and then to come back. And in that coming back to the caregiver, there's this moment of the expression of interest in what you've discovered. And there's a lot of repetition in this. So the child brings you a broken bottle cap and you ooh and you ah and you give it back to them. And they bring you a rock and then you ooh and you ah and you give it back to them. And all of the things that they discover in the environment that looks interesting to them. And then they come and they present it to you like they've made this discovery, and the way that they experience the world and the things that affect them matter. And that all comes from this expression of interest from the caregiver. 1 time, 10 times, 40 times. And in each time, in receiving the child and what they've discovered and engaging in not an empty praise of it, but a curiosity over what was interesting to them, what mattered to them. This is the thing that trains us very early to discover something. But that tends to happen mainly to kids who grow up to be secure, and insecure, disorganized kids don't have that experience of exploration. So they develop a different relationship to it. When you look at the anxious avoidant child, they're neglected and often experience a high level of rejection. So that coming back to the caregiver and presenting them with something, and the caregiver expressing interest, doesn't happen for them. So they don't learn that vital piece of exploration. They don't learn the capacity of sharing the things that matter to them. And if they have a rejecting parent, they learn really to keep what really matters to them secret, because the experience of having what really matters to you rejected over and over again is so painful that you begin to shut down around that. Because an anxious avoidant child, somebody who grows up to be dismissing, doesn't really have the support for primary exploration, and they don't really have the support for their needs independent of what their caregiver thinks that they should have. They get good at gathering the things that they need to support themselves in a way that isn't particularly collaborative. They learn a process of idealizing idealizing means that you present a positive view and you strip out all of the negative stuff. But really what you're reflecting to the parents, to the caregivers, is the things that they value. To get good at that, recognizing in other people what they value and offering it to them so that they'll give you what you want. Really good for secondary exploration, but not so good for primary exploration. So you have, in dismissing people, usually a pretty well-developed capacity for secondary exploration, but not so much for primary. In anxious ambivalent children, the people who grow up to be preoccupied, what they have is interference by the caregivers in their development of the capacity to explore. It's usually some form of overprotectedness, which isn't really overprotectedness. What we're really looking at is a role reversal where the child is in some way instrumental to the caregiver regulating their own experience, and the caregiver not really being able to tolerate the separation of the child because it's too dysregulating for them. So their solution to that is to prevent the child from separating from them by limiting their exploration. That creates in a child somebody who's stunted in the capacity to explore. So then they become dependent on somebody directing their exploration. So they're good. They can be good at support for somebody else's exploration, but they're not really engaged so much in their own exploration. This in adults takes on the form of wishing to find meaningfulness in relationships because the proximity is what helps them regulate. The problem with trying to replace primary exploration with a relationship is the relationship really doesn't provide that kind of meaning. And so you're in a relationship situation, even if it's pretty stable, and you feel a sense of deprivation of meaning. And often it creates an antagonism with your partner because they're not providing the meaning that you want. Is that making sense? Lacey?
Yeah, hi. I was just curious, what exactly you mean by primary exploration then? So if people are seeking out relationships in order to find meaning because they're not exploring the kind of primary exploration, what would the kind of ideal be with primary exploration?
Um, for me, it's really about ideas
Hmm.
that people have and my experience of ideas. I'm very visually oriented in my thinking, so visual representations of ideas is very interesting to me.
Hmm.
I like to read. I like to read different kinds of authors, different points of view, and it helps me to understand the world that I live in and where I can participate in the world. I really like the idea of poking the world as much as I can. That's where I find
Hmm.
meaning. But I'm an artist, and so the nature of art is to make these representations and then push them into the world for reaction. That is actually the process of
Hmm.
making art, even if the world, which I find mostly is completely and utterly indifferent. Still, the activity is the activity. Where relationships come in, of course, is that you need to find the path of expression, and the relationships are a good sounding board and a way of processing the understanding of these things. And also, the ups and downs of life, you need support with, and other people are very good at that. So there is definitely a richness to relationships and definitely a meaning that comes from relationships. But the primary exploration, the thing that you need to know so that you have a sense of richness and fulfillment is unlikely to come from relationships, because that's not really their function in the human condition. That helping?
Got it. And you're saying generally people that are more insecure, particularly anxious, tend to make relationships their kind of primary meaning rather than exploring what that might be for themselves.
Right. And it creates a chronic dissatisfaction with the partner, which is not really their fault, because you have an expectation of that. Sometimes if you hook up with somebody who has a vibrant exploration, then you can derive meaning from participating in that in a supporting role, which is often what happens with preoccupied people. They take on a supporting role for somebody else's exploration and derive enough meaning that it isn't unsettling that they're not engaged in their own exploration. But if you can really shift that so that you're pursuing the things that matter to you, that get you going, and then have that social support group that you can come back and express that would be ideal. In order to do that, if you're preoccupied, of course, is you're going to have to learn to emotionally regulate enough to separate from other people in order to go and explore.
Right.
That's one of the things that hangs up preoccupied people, is they're not able to regulate themselves independent of the person that they regulate with. And so they can't really separate it long enough to go and pursue the things that have meaning. They also don't have that long childhood history of developing an understanding of how to separate what's meaningful from what isn't meaningful. And so it's harder for them because they need to develop that capacity of discernment for meaning, and then discover the things that are meaningful and how to pursue them. Whereas most of the other attachment strategies already have enough skill at exploration that they can make those discernments.
That makes sense. Okay. And if there's a question that ties into something with myself, would you prefer I bring that to the class tomorrow morning that I'm in with you, or is tonight also a time to do that kind of thing?
Is it on the topic of exploration?
Maybe it gears a bit more to the relational stuff, so perhaps I can bookmark that for tomorrow.
Yes, do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Mudit?
Hello, George.
Hi.
I know you were talking about the artist aspect.
Yeah.
Is it true that exploration without the support from the group that you're coming back to and sharing it with will not make the experience meaningful? Like, what if you're doing an activity, but you're not reporting it back to, or you're not getting that feeling of validation from somebody else or some support group? Does that not come cycle?
One of the dangers of exploration is that it becomes a auto-regulating strategy, that you engage in an activity that provides enough involvement that you don't miss the connection to other people. But what you miss, and dismissing people or avoiding people have this difficulty. They engage in things that are interesting to them, but the purpose of the engagement is to auto-regulate so that they don't require involvement with other people, which I wouldn't really call this the vibrancy of a primary exploration. Oftentimes, dismissing people, particularly when there's been rejection in their childhoods, keep their primary exploration completely secret from other people. So they might engage in that process, but because it isn't expressed, the synergy with other people's exploration and the energy that comes from that isn't there. And so it becomes much harder to sustain the exploration because there isn't that energy that's pushing you forward. That the encouragement to go out, find out what you need to know, and then the idea that you can come rushing back and express it, and then you're engaged with somebody whose exploration is close enough to what you're doing that there's a synergy in the exchange with the information that they find out. So you have to explore in some sense much less than you would because you're finding out these other things that are of vital importance. And that whole thing carries you through the exploration. So you really get out to the edges of the things that you need to know, which doesn't happen if you do it on your own.
I see. So the part of the auto-regulation involves coming back and sharing.
Yes, otherwise it can, the auto-regulation piece is the piece that allows you to be independent of other people.
Right, but you're saying that's not enough, that you need to come back and share it.
Well, it's the same difficulty. You're not going to take risks that would dysregulate you to the point that you can't solve the dysregulation because you don't have a safety net. So in some sense, it's like what's the difference between the freedom of somebody who's on the high wire, but they have a safety net, and somebody who doesn't have a safety net on the high wire? One is very cautious and restricted, and one is free because even if you make a mistake, you're going to be caught. So I think that that's one of the differences.
Oh, I see. Failing in the exploration, that you know that's fine, even if you fail. Oh, I see.
Whereas if you're auto-regulating and you get so dysregulated that you can't regulate yourself, who do you go to help you with that if you haven't set up a social network to support it? Then, typically you're turning toward processor or substance addictions to manage that. Or you just begin to restrict the risks that you're willing to take so that you don't dysregulate yourself. And in restricting the risks you take, you restrict the meaning that you discover.
Yeah, I think this word meaning definitely comes to me with this sort of emotion. I mean, I'm idolizing this feeling that, oh, I'm going to do this activity and I'm going to feel meaningful every day. But I think it's, for me, it's also coming half with sharing with somebody. It's almost like, oh, I can share with you because you know this and it feels good to share what I learned.
Right. Well, and also in deepening the understanding and deepening the perspective, you have your own conditioning, your own capacity to create reality. And when you compare that to somebody else's conditioning and somebody else's capacity to create reality, it often creates a perspective that deepens the understanding of the experience that you wouldn't necessarily be able to find on your
own. With people who have common interest, not with anybody.
Yes, absolutely. The explorations need to be not exactly the same, but lined up enough that there's value in the exchange. You express your discoveries to somebody and they benefit from you expressing that to them because it helps them with their exploration. And they express to you what they're discovering. And that's helpful to you because it helps you with your exploration.
I see, not just acknowledgement from the other. I thought a simple acknowledgement or a simple interest from their side is enough, but it has to be some sort of exchange, more deeper exchange, not just, oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Acknowledgements.
Right. The acknowledgement itself is not enough. It has to be an exchange of ideas that is beneficial to both people.
I see.
And I mean specifically that it benefits your capacity to explore the things that have meaning to you. And the things that you discover are helpful to them and what they're exploring. So there's a relationship to each of your explorations, but not identical, because it would not provide the perspective.
Mm. Thank you so much. And I have one more question about exploration, because it's confusing. Is the exploration involve creation, or you mentioned participation, because that's what I've been doing, and I feel, oh, I need to create something, or I need to provide to somebody else, and that is confusing to me. Because I enjoy going to, let's say, retreats, but
Right.
but I'm not giving retreats, I'm not teaching retreats, so it's almost like,
Well, if you're unretreated, you have an understanding of the nature of the teaching, and you express that understanding, and that provides a perspective to somebody else that then helps them understand the teaching. Then that would become what I would call that exchange of primary exploration. You don't have to originate the teaching. In fact, it's very hard to originate anything. We're so culturally affected that almost all of the stuff is coming into us in some way already formed. So really, it's the placement of the experiences and concepts in a kind of juxtaposition that helps to explain it. But we're all unique, and our conditioning is all unique, and it really is enough to express authentically what your experience of making this into reality is. That actually at the basis of it is enough. I think sometimes there's an expectation that it has to be this amazing thing.
exactly.
But
That's what I've been struggling with.
Really, if you could express to somebody authentically your experience of what's happening, that would be enough perspective for them to be able to understand it in a way that they wouldn't be able to from their own perspective. And that is so enlivening, so enriching. That's enough. I mean, we do. And then part of that, I think, is also the nature of culture, the culture that we live in, valuing some things and not valuing others, and the complete inequality of the distribution of resources that make some things seem like they're not worth much, like teaching, for instance, grade school.
Exactly, yeah. Or painting, or things that don't
Right.
make money. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then also when you look at the nature of how uh, information is controlled in a way that it's never been before, everything is coming at us through the internet, and it's so easy to throttle the internet in terms of what information comes out and what information doesn't come out, what's valuable and what isn't. We're really in this stunning time of a particular point of view being heralded as the great idea, and everything else being devalued.
Yeah, what's valuable and what's not is a big.
So really, we need to have perspective about the nature of culture and step out of it and turn toward ourselves to understand what is actually meaningful to us, and then setting up our lives in such a way that we can pursue that meaning. For most of us, we're going to be bound by the requirements of culture, and so I would say a balance between primary and secondary exploration is mainly what we're going to be able to do, unless you luck out. And the thing that really is meaningful to you is also the thing valued by culture. But the hierarchy of culture is such that I'm not in a favored group, so I don't have access to all of that stuff, and I don't think because I don't have access to it that I'm somehow diminished in what's important to me. Although I have to say that I'm astonished by the number of times a day I see a reference to buy a really big house, and you've made it. Is that all making sense? This is a really big topic, exploration, and so I think we should talk about it a lot because it's going to be helpful. What is it that the early conditioning is so fundamentally important in terms of your capacity to explore? And if you didn't have that, it doesn't mean you can't learn to do it now. It's just that in some sense, you're going to be playing catch up as you learn to do it. Dismissing people need to shift from protecting primary exploration and moving it into a place of exchange with other people. Preoccupied people really need to learn the basics of exploration and then begin to discover the things that have meaning. I haven't talked about disorganized people at all, but one of the things that happens to disorganized people because their childhoods are one of abuse or trauma is that the natural instinct for exploration is also often the vehicle through which they're exploited. And so there's an emphasis of safety on exploring for disorganized people. The other problem that disorganized people have is that they're unable to sustain an activity for very long, and so their exploration experiences these starts and stops. So a lot of beginnings, some middles, but no finishes, and so they don't have the sense that you can succeed and derive a lot of meaning from exploration because they don't get to that part very well. So that reliability piece is the center for disorganized people. Secure people, of course, have always had the experience of the things that mattered to them being valued. And so they tend to do that naturally, and they organize their lives in such a way that they can do that. But I do want to have some time to meditate. So why don't we focus on that a little bit? One of the pieces for exploration is the capacity to emotionally regulate and also the development of intentional positivity. And that's really done through the heart practices. So why don't we do some loving kindness practice? We'll start with an easy person and then switch to practicing for self. You want to spend a lot of time practicing loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity for the self, so that when the self experience arises, it's a pleasant and enjoyable experience that you. If you come from difficult circumstances in childhood, often what you have is a negative, automatic negative interpretation of what's happening. And each time the self activity arises, there's that negative boost that you have. And we can become quite aversive to that, which is the origin of self-hatred. If we lopside our experience to the positive side, then each time the sense of self arises, it's an enjoyable experience, which we're glad to have. And that really is the origin of self-love. And that's going to be a lot of time spent on the development of the positive experience. So go ahead and settle into your meditation posture. All right, let go of the meditation. So comments or questions about that? So let's see what's coming up. Saturday is the third day of the level 1 series that we're doing currently. take a look at that. We did have on the calendar a meditation and addiction course toward the end of the month, but we're going to move that to June. I'm going to travel the second week of June until the the second week of May until the third week of June. So this class won't meet those weeks. I think there's 5 weeks that we won't meet, and then we'll come back. We'll send out some notices so you get that. But just understand that there's going to be a gap there. I'm going to be doing a retreat in Poland for a couple of weeks. I'm going to do one in Utrecht for 4 days, and then I'm going to do a little bit of traveling in the UK and Ireland. Turns out, according to 23andMe, I'm from the Donegal area of Western Ireland. So we're going to go do a tour. This is similar to the tour we did around Cork when 23andMe said that my family came from Cork. So they're constantly updating their database. Anyway, it's rugged and beautiful. If you haven't been to Ireland, I think it'll be fun. And then I'll be back. We're going to be doing a series of classes called Meditation and Addiction. So we have developed a way of working with addiction, both process and substance addictions. So we're going to do it in the different ways that we do it. We'll do a short workshop on it on a Friday evening. Then we'll do a series of half days. Some sense, though, our level 0 is the workshop. Our level 1 is the weekend, the Saturday, half day Saturdays. And then we're going to do a level 2 intensive meditation and addiction, which we've never actually done outside of the treatment center environment. And that's going to be a 3 times a week, 12-week intensive. So Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 6 to 7 p.m. Pacific time. For 12 weeks, we'll go through the deep dive into the curriculum around that. I don't make much distinction between process addictions and substance addictions. Usually with substance addictions, the tolerance comes in a big way because you have to keep increasing the doses in order to have the same effect, and that causes a lot of interventions from the outside. But often with the process addictions, we can get away with them for a really long time before they become enough of a problem that it disrupts our social experience. But it's very unusual for people who use substances not to also have a bundle of process addictions that they use at the same time. And I like to address them all as one group so that we really understand that system. Otherwise, back in the day, I've been sober for 45 years, so a lot of the references I have are old, but we used to say switching addictions was like switching tables on the Titanic. And so if you could grab the whole bunch of them and really see how they operate in this integrated experience, it's easier to begin to move out of that into something else. So I'm excited about it. I've never really done it before in this way, so we'll see how it goes. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that if you're a resource, you'll consider making a donation to Mettagroup. That helps support me and also the work that we're doing. You can find the donation link on our website. I probably should locate it and put it in the chat. I'll figure that out and try. Maybe I'll start doing that, but it shouldn't be too hard to find on our Mettagroup website. Thank you for practicing and really appreciate it. Yes, I think food is one of them. So food is an interesting one in the sense that it's a different constellation than a lot of the other ones are. there's a high association in terms of attachment toward preoccupied people that also have a rejecting early experience. Most of the time, addictions are avoidant strategies. So you're looking at a high level of neglect, sometimes with rejection, but food is one of the ones that really is more oriented toward preoccupied people who have also had a rejecting experience in childhood. In the way that that works, when you're involved in the mindset of the caregiver and your role reversed so that you have to take care of them, when the child presents to the caregiver their natural attachment needs and their natural needs for care, the caregiver is rejecting of those, but insisting on the care that the child provides them. That's the constellation. So that's one of the things that's interesting, to look at these things through the attachment perspective. Anyway, thank you. We'll see you soon, I hope. Bye.